Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Ich übergebe gleich an Stephen Shore, aber erst eine ganz kurze Einführung und Vorstellung von ihm. Und würden Sie mir bitte auch ihm zur Ehre einen Sprachwechsel gestatten? Auch er wird in Englisch sprechen. Stephen Shore is one of the most versatile, influential, and widely exhibited photographers of our time. And as the CO retrospective shows us, and as Felix just mentioned, he also can look back on an extraordinarily long career. He developed his first snapshots at the age of 6. He took his first photos at the age of 8, and he sold 3 of those at the age of 14 to none other than Edward Steichen, who at that time was the curator of the Museum of Modern Art. Quite an accomplishment for someone in their puberty. At the age of 18, he became a regular visitor at Andy Warhol's factory, and just 6 years later, he had his first solo exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the first living photographer since Alfred Stieglitz, who had had his solo show there 45 years earlier. His photos and his photographic series have been published in numerous books and shown in exhibitions worldwide. And since 1982, he has been the director of the photography program at Bard College in Almondale on the Hudson in New York. Stephen Shore, a very, very warm welcome. It is an honor to have you with us. You will get us started with a short presentation, and I look forward to our dialogue afterward, also with the public. So the stage is yours.
Thank you, Melinda, and Felix. Thank you for the introductions. This is a picture by Ansel Adams. In the mid-1970s, I think it was 76, I was invited to a friend's house for dinner and had dinner with Adams. During that dinner, he had already been drinking when I arrived, and during that dinner, I saw him drink 6 glasses like this of straight vodka. And at one point, very late at night, he said, with a kind of photographer's objectivity in his voice, looking back on his life, he said, I had a creative hot streak in the 1940s, and since then I've been potboiling. Potboiling means just churning out work for money. And I remember thinking, gee, when I'm 85 and having dinner with a young, aspiring 25-year-old photographer, I don't want to look back on my life and have that assessment. And that clarified for me that when I found myself repeating myself in my work, that I would change and do something different. And also it clarified for me, looking back on what I had done up till then, that I had, in a certain way, already had been doing that. And when I look at the show at CO Berlin, which I hope you all have a chance to visit, one of the themes for me looking at it is this continual search for new photographic issues to pursue. So this dinner with Adams was the 5th of 5 important formative events for me that I'd like to talk about this afternoon. The first of the 5 was for my 6th birthday, an uncle of mine gave me, knowing of my interest in chemistry, he gave me a darkroom set, which was made by Kodak and had small hard rubber trays and a developing tank and little packets of chemistry and a print frame and an instruction booklet. And I taught myself to develop and print. I don't have any of the prints from that time, but this is a picture of me at that time on the right there. I feel very fortunate that, this was just by chance, that this was the insight of a relative that led to this immediate connection I had to photography. The next of these formative events happened a couple of years later. This is a self-portrait I made when I was 10 years old, and you might be able to tell from this picture that I was living in an apartment house. This was in New York City. And our upstairs neighbor was the head of a music publishing company and a very cultured person, and he knew of my interest in photography. By that time, I had gotten a 35 millimeter camera and had been photographing for about 2 years. And for my birthday, he gave me Walker Evans' book, American Photographs. So that was the first photography book I ever owned, and I couldn't think of a better chance than being exposed to this person who, for me, is the seminal American photographer of the 20th century. But more than that, I felt an almost spiritual kinship with him, that there was something that connected us in our seeing. So I think I was more than influenced by him, that I recognized a connection. Any of you here now, were any of you at the opening last night, at the talk by Christoph Schaden? Good, because he mentioned something that I want to say again. I don't want it to sound old hat. Walker Evans was, I believe, the first photographer to have a show at the Museum of Modern Art. It was curated, the head of the photography department at the time was Beaumont Newhall. And Newhall wrote a book called History of Photography, which went through many different editions over the years. And in one of the early editions had a chapter called Recent Trends. That was the last chapter. And he talked about 4 recent trends. And they were the document, the straight photograph, the formalist photograph, and the equivalent. And by the document, he was essentially saying a photograph that pointed at something in the world and said, pay attention to this, look at this is worthy of your attention. The straight photograph was the self-conscious work of art that was saying, the photographer was saying, look at this image on this piece of paper that I made. This is worthy of your attention. The formalist photograph is a photograph that explores the formal nature of photography and the structural qualities of an image. And the equivalent, here Newhall borrows a term from Alfred Stieglitz. The equivalent is a photograph that embodies an emotional state or state of mind, or what T.S. Eliot called the objective correlative of an emotional state. And what struck me about this writing of Newhall's was that these did not have to be 4 distinct trends, but that for me the best photographs, like this picture by Evans of the dining room in the Belle Grove plantation are equally all four. And Evans added something to that. He talked about photographing in documentary style. In other words, he adopted a visual style that referenced a vernacular tradition. He understood that the visual style is a cultural signifier, and that by adopting that style, he is drawing certain meaning and cultural reference to a viewer's interpretation of the image. This is the cover of a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, written in the 1960s by Thomas Kuhn, who was a historian of science at MIT. It's in this work by Kuhn that the word paradigm, which had existed for a long time in our language, but it was this work that brought the word paradigm to the public attention. That we use it commonly today is because of this book. And Kuhn says that a paradigm has to have two qualities. It has to be sufficiently unprecedented and sufficiently open-ended. Now, we understand what something unprecedented means, but open-ended. He means it has to form the basis of further exploration. Now, this is a photograph, work of art, by a friend of mine named Vic Muniz, who, in this picture, has taken chocolate and dripped it on a white surface and then photographed it. And Vic's work is, from what I've seen, totally unprecedented. But it's not open-ended. In other words, if someone else came along and did a different picture in chocolate, or in molasses, or in something else, everyone would say, you're just copying Muniz. It's a singular vision. It's not an open-ended vision. What Evans produced was a paradigm that other people could then build on and follow. The third transformative experience for me, or formative event, was meeting Andy Warhol. In late 1964, I'd just turned 17. I was going to school, or actually not going to school. I was enrolled in school, but was spending no time there, and was photographing and going I wanted to learn the history of cinema and was going to movies every day, probably 2 movies a day, and reading a lot of contemporary drama and going to museums and doing anything I could to avoid going to school. And I made a short film that fall, which in the beginning of 1965 was shown at a theater in New York called the Filmmakers Cinematheque, the same night that Warhol showed one of his films called The Life of Juanita Castro. And I was introduced to him and asked if I could come to the factory to photograph. And he said yes. And at that point, I officially dropped out of school. I could sit in a class and zone out while the teacher was saying things that have no interest for me, or I could hang out at the factory every day. And that was a no-brainer. And so I spent 3 years on and off at the factory. It's what I did instead of going to college. I didn't do it because I had my best interests at heart. I did it because it was exciting and it was fun. But looking back on it, I see that this was my first real exposure to aesthetic thinking. Andy was very open about his process of producing work, whether it be filmmaking or painting. And through that, contact with him, seeing him work every day, seeing him make aesthetic decisions again and again and again, I really learned the basis for me of aesthetic thought. Another thing I think was clarified for me during that time, Andy had what I would call a distanced delight in contemporary culture. What I mean was he found it fascinating, but he found it fascinating from a little bit of a distance. It wasn't exactly cynical. I think he really took pleasure in it. And I think that there was a connection I felt with that kind of thinking. Just as I felt a connection with Evans's work that was not simply a matter of influence, I found a connection to that relationship to culture, which I then saw years later surface in my relationship to American culture as I photographed it. The fourth of these 5 formative events happened when I had a meeting with the curator Caspar Koenig. Caspar, who has gone on to really illustrious work now, was a young curator, and he was editing a catalog of Andy Warhol's work for the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1968. And we were working in a loft in Soho, editing my work in the catalog. I had about 160 pages of photographs in the catalog. And we were sequencing it. And when we finished, he said, "I have something to show you." And on the floor of the loft, he laid out Ed Ruscha's book, Every Building on Sunset Strip, which you see here. It was a really shocking event for me because I understood a different way photography can be used, and it brought connections for me from the aesthetic thinking I had learned and saw in operation at the factory, and the awareness I had of Andy's use of serial imagery. And now I saw how photography could really be deeply connected to this kind of aesthetic thought. And that set really my work off for a long time afterward. The next project I did after I left the factory were conceptually based sequences, which are in the show. I don't really want to go over everything I've done in my career because it's all there a block away from here, and it would take too long. But I wanted to give you a little background on how I got here, how I got to this place where the show really begins. And now Melinda and I will have a conversation, and then I would love to answer any question you have. And let me add that while we're talking, I may kind of scroll through pictures.
Oh, good. Absolutely. That would be very enriching.
Good.
Thank you very much, Stephen Shore. So as Stephen and Felix both mentioned, it is an extraordinary span in the retrospective. It begins when you're 14. It ends with a picture you took the day before yesterday, I think, on your...
Yesterday.
Yesterday Instagram feed, right?
While I was at the opening, I posted a picture.
Great.
So
okay. So
the show will be current.
So the first couple of photos show a tripod, they show your shadow. You are very much present in these first photos in the exhibition when you're 14. And then later on, we move to photos where you were striving for an unmediated effect, a kind of a neutrality, essentially removing yourself from the viewer's perception. How do you get from the one to the other? What was the bridge?
It's really a great question. every now and then I would see a snapshot that had this, we now, what you refer to and I have referred to in the past as an unmediated experience of the world. And what I mean by that is a look of a photograph that doesn't feel that it's mediated by visual convention. Let me explain this by an analogy. I think everyone has had the experience that when you're writing something, you use a slightly different language than you would use if you're just speaking. It's more formal. You may even use a slightly different vocabulary. And it's that distinction I was interested in. Why do we write differently than we speak? Why do we photograph differently than we see? And I wanted to explore that. And so what I did, and now I would say this is the year 1972 when this picture was made. And this is part of the series. Here, let me turn it this way so you can see what I have up there without having to turn around. This is the series American Surfaces. And what I would do as a mental exercise, at various times during the day, whenever I thought of it, I took a mental snapshot of my field of vision, what we would now call a screenshot of, I'm having a conversation with someone. I'm sitting in a room talking to all of you. I'm in an elevator. Wherever I happen to be, not when I'm photographing, but just any time randomly during the day, I take the screenshot, which I then would kind of look at, examine. How is it structured? And I used that as the basis of how I structured my pictures, so that they would look like the experience of seeing. And that's what I meant about the less mediated experience. I wanted to get to an experience of the world that felt more real, that was not through the filter of visual convention.
You had, in the meantime, been working in the factory. Did that influence that transition? Warhol, of course, was quite interested in the everyday object, what you might say, the commonplace.
I think that influenced the content of the pictures, but not this quality of seeing. That was something I'd been working on and had been on my mind actually for a number of years. That one of the thoughts behind some of the conceptual work was, if I could take some of the decision-making process out of my hands, if I were to take a picture exactly on the second every hour and half hour, wherever the person I was photographing would be, some of the decisions are taken out of my hands. If I could take some of the decisions out of my hands, I could short-circuit this impulse of imposing myself on the picture. But I found that didn't work. That because I felt that I ought to be able to do it by learning how to see differently and not rely on a mechanism. And that's what led to the visual aspect of American Surfaces. The content of it really came from this desire to explore American culture through a road trip where I was photographing. I wasn't pretending I was an invisible traveler through the land. I was actually photographing my experience of the road trip. So I was photographing every meal I ate, every television I watched, every toilet I used,
In a way, giving us a picture of America as a kind of a series of repetitive motifs.
Well, it was using the repetitive motifs, yes, to build a picture of an aspect of the culture. But it was this funny thing of, I'm taking a trip, that doesn't have a destination, is I'm not trying to go from New York to Chicago. I'm taking a trip for the purpose of taking a trip so I can photograph the trip as a way of opening a door into seeing something of American culture.
You're sometimes seen as a kind of a bridge between documentary photography and concept art that uses photography as a medium. Do you think that's right, and does it apply to this work in American Surfaces?
Well, I think I, for a long time, have always photographed with a kind of conscious intentionality. And sometimes, in certain work in this show, it's a very specific concept that generates the picture. But sometimes the intentionality is different. But I find there's almost always an intentionality in the work. But at the same time, it's always visual. So there is this meeting of the two worlds. And let me relate that to the Becher's work, because some people think of their work as conceptual, but the concept of each series of theirs is not complex. It's not like, say, a Douglas Hubler concept, which says you stand at this geographical coordinate and you face due north and take a picture. They're saying we're going to photograph from roughly the same distance and roughly the same light water towers in different cultures. That's just an ideational framework. What makes the pictures is something photographic. They're photographers. They're interested in the content, not just a fulfillment of a conceptual framework.
And in fact, you told me yesterday evening that Hilla Becher had told you you should take a picture of every main street to be found in the US, and you said, no, I'm looking for the quintessential main street.
Yes, and that was a difference in our temperament. I have had the greatest admiration for the Becher's work, and we were friends since '73, but I knew their work from before. And I think it had an influence on me in the way I just described, in recognizing that you could have an intentionality, but the picture is also something visual. But they had a kind of cataloging framework, and that's not what I was doing.
So you have said...
And let me add that when I present American Surfaces, even though I may have photographed every meal I ate, I'm not actually showing every one. I'm only showing the ones that seem the most resonant.
So you have said that at each phase in your work, which is so amazingly versatile, you were essentially trying to answer a question that had posed itself to you. Do I then understand that American Surfaces was, in a way, addressing a dual question, both formal and content-driven?
All the work, I would say, does that, yes.
So
exactly.
If we could get one of the American Surfaces picture photos that has a car in it, that would be of great interest to me, because we were talking a little earlier about the role of the cars in these photos. If we see some of them now, that amazing Cadillac dealership, for example, or is that from later? That's from a bit later.
Yes.
Oh, that's from Surfaces, okay. Yes. Of course, to us it looks like a nostalgic picture now. It's almost moving in the nostalgia of those cars, but you have said yourself at other times, those cars would not have been seen in that way at the time these pictures were first exhibited.
Right, and people sometimes say to me recently that my pictures seem nostalgic, and what I think is, well, pictures are not nostalgic, people are nostalgic. and I can assure you that when these pictures were first shown, no one felt any nostalgia, and many people were baffled why anyone would photograph what was simply everyday life.
Yet you put the cars in there quite intentionally as markers.
Yes, because I understood that cars have a very particular function as time markers in photographs. That you can photograph a street and buildings could be built in 1950 and 1850, and you don't know when the picture was taken, except you knew it was after 1950. but unless the cars themselves are very old cars, and an antique car show has come to town, cars give a real time marker in the picture, and I was aware from looking at old photographs that that was something that dated the picture for me. And so I knew that when I'm taking a picture today, even though I'm trying to get to the center of modern experience, that in the future, 30 years hence, those cars would set the picture at a particular moment in time.
They also tell us a lot about the American West. The American West is an absolutely car-dependent society.
Yes.
And this, of course, is also very striking for anyone who lives in Europe, the emptiness in these photos and the central role of cars.
Yes, and sometimes people have asked me, why do I avoid people in my pictures? And it's a complex answer. This was taken with 35 millimeter, but then for the next 30 years, I was using a view camera on a tripod, usually an 8x10, for which it's very difficult to stop motion. But that wasn't the reason. The reason is that people drive, and if I wanted a person in this picture, this is, I think, in Lubbock, Texas, if I wanted a person, I might have to wait a half an hour for someone to walk by.
Yeah. You once said that the people in American surfaces could, in a way, themselves be seen as surfaces. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was interested in how they dressed. I'm interested in, I can't photograph cultural forces except through how they exhibit themselves in the visible world. I can only photograph what's visible. And cultural forces can, in certain ways, show themselves in style, in palette, in design, in architecture. And so that was the material that, as a photographer, I have to work with. There's an Arab saying, the apparent is the bridge to the real. So it's through the surface that the surface, which is what is accessible to the camera, that something below the surface is manifest.
There's another kind of example of that. How hard would it be to find the Sambo photo? This, by the way,
I'm not sure I have it.
Is addressed in the excellent interview to be found in the catalog of the CO retrospective with David Campany. And I must pay my respect to that interview because it is very inspiring. So in this photo, to the right, we see the sign Sambos. And those who know U.S. children's literature may know that there was a book called Little Black Sambo. And Sambo is a racist term that was used on signs for this chain of restaurants. So when I looked at this photo as a journalist, I asked myself, is this a political picture? Because it reminds us that this was part of people's daily experience, driving down that street, seeing a sign that is basically a racist designation.
Yes.
Political?
Well, I was cognizant of that. My work tends to be not overtly political, but in examining the culture, I couldn't ignore this blatant racism.
And the effect it would have had on anybody.
But I didn't.
Who
But again, I'm
traversed
not
that street.
focusing on it in the picture. So it appears to be a picture of. It's one part of a larger picture.
Right.
One thing I found using an 8x10 camera is that the description of the camera is so fine that I don't have to focus in on something that is a point of interest. I could have many points of interest in the picture, and that changes the viewer's relationship to the image. Rather than seeing through my eyes, I'm creating a little world that a viewer can move their attention through. And so it's not kind of in your face, this is Sambo's, although you can't look at the picture without noticing it. But the picture has lots of other things going on at the same time.
And you are reminding us that simply by joining all those things in a frame, you've put a relationship between very, very disparate elements.
Yes.
There's an immense amount of randomness and disparateness in many of these scenes, and all that emptiness in the middle.
Yeah.
So the reception for American Surfaces initially was not all that enthusiastic.
American Surfaces got terrible reception. Because you have to think that since I've already done one piece of name dropping, saying I had dinner with Ansel Adams, I'll do my one second piece of name dropping. In '73, I had a show at the same gallery that I was showing at in New York, Light Gallery. This was, I'll show you some work that was in the show. And another artist who was represented by the same gallery was Paul Strand, and we had lunch together. And he, in the kindest, most grandfatherly way, helping a young man who was clearly deluded, informed me that higher emotion, I'm quoting exactly, higher emotions cannot be communicated in color. I had already read Kandinsky at the time and knew that he would have very different feelings about that. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I'm sitting with this person, and he's telling me higher emotions cannot be communicated in color. And this was the attitude of art photography. And the print had to be made by the artist's hand. I mean, Cartier-Bresson, who had work made by labs, was a little sketchy, you know, because he wasn't doing it himself. They had to be beautifully framed and handled as exquisite, precious works of art. And I put up American Surfaces. They were color, which was
taboo,
vulgar, according to Walker Evans at the time. Although he wound up working in color. They were machine-made Kodak prints, not even made by a fine lab like Cartier-Bresson, but just churned out by a Kodak machine. They were not hung individually, but hung as a grid, and not framed and matted, but stuck on the wall with double-sided tape. And then on top of it...
snapshotness.
Yes, and then they looked like they weren't composed, and they were, you know... And so in every possible way, it's what in Paul Strand's world photography should not be. So it got... the show didn't get a great response. There were a couple of people who responded well to it. One was Weston Neff, who was at the time the curator of photography at the Met, who bought the entire show for the Met. I would only sell it as an entire show. I wouldn't sell the pictures individually. That sounds like a big purchase. It was 220 prints for $220. But nonetheless, the intention was there to acquire it for the Met.
And despite the words of Mr. Strand, you kept on going, and you made a transition then, both in terms of the technology that you worked with. You left behind, I gather, the Raleigh that you had been using and moved to a different format. And there's also a shift that we can see when you move on to Uncommon Places, perhaps from the emphasis on objects to scenes. So what was the question that had come up in your mind? How did the question change
Yeah.
from American Surfaces to Uncommon Places?
Well, using the first year of Uncommon Places, I used a 4x5, and then very quickly switched to an 8x10, which was then the only camera I used for the next 30 years. Looking at when you use an 8x10, you're looking at a ground glass on the back of the camera that's 8 inches by 10 inches. To look at a ground glass that size on a tripod forces all the decisions one makes as a photographer to become not just glaringly conscious, but almost physical. So that if I want to, with a 35 millimeter, I can breathe and the frame moves slightly. If I wanted to move the frame with an 8x10, I'd have to lift it up. And this is a camera that, weighs 25 pounds or something. So I have to lift it up and move it over and set it down. If I want to lower it a tiny bit, I have to crank it down. This sounds like it may not mean anything, but somehow engaging your body physically in the decision makes the decision more concrete. And so as I became aware of all of these photographic decisions, I spent most of that decade following a series of questions which would arise on their own. And as I would address each question, new questions kept arising. And to kind of sum it up, they were all based on the idea that I'm looking at a three-dimensional world flowing in time in front of me. And then that world gets transformed into a flat, static, bounded, two-dimensional image. And that transformation is based on certain decisions a photographer makes and certain formal qualities of an image. So, for example, the camera sees with monocular vision, and the monocular image is projected onto a plane, means things in the foreground and things in the background, which can be separated by literally miles, bear a relationship to each other in a way they don't in real life. And so, for example, in this picture, the telephone lines and the jet trails, which are separated by probably literally miles, look connected. The world flows in time. A photograph doesn't. And so here's a moment taken out of the flow of time. The photograph has edges which define what's in it and what's out of it. It defines the content, but it also is the beginning of a picture's geometry. And so the lines in the pavement from the left corner, the painted line, and then the shadows coming in from the bottom, all are relating to the edge. The funny curve of the arch of the building relates to the edge. The fourth major transformative factor is that a photograph always prioritizes one plane of focus, and that even if, for those who are photographers, you stop the lens down and get maximum depth of field is not a thickening of the plane of focus. The plane of focus always is on a single plane. And so here, in this picture, the plane of focus is on this couple waiting at the street corner. If I were to move the plane of focus to a different part of the picture, the meaning of the picture changes. And so it's these four factors that are the major transformative factors, and it's these four factors that for most of that decade I tried to dissect and see, what if I did it this way? What if I did it that way? What if I'm playing with them?
So the work becomes, in a sense, more structural, more analytic. And you said that in the process of making the photos for Uncommon Places, you felt there had also been a kind of progression that the photos get denser and denser and denser.
Yes.
And then there's a kind of a break, and then they get simpler. What happened there? What was going on?
Yes. Well, this is 1975, and this picture was for me a pivotal one. It was taken in Los Angeles at the intersection of Beverly and La Brea. And this is when I was trying to make the pictures as dense as possible. And I'm looking at the relationship of every pole and every sign and positioning myself in space, thinking about what I just described as the relationship of things in the foreground to things in the background and how they appear on the plane of the picture. But I realized as I was taking it that in an attempt to organize all this space, to attempt to juggle all these elements, I was imposing a very classical structural framework that while the subject matter is different, structurally it was very different, it was very similar to how Claude Lorrain would structure a picture. And that this became an organizing principle. I had to have some way of organizing it, and I found myself relying on this organizing principle. And that part of me that is sounds the alarm when I recognize visual convention, said, whoa, hold on here. You know, you're using a 17th century structural principle to solve a 20th century problem. So the next day I went back to the same intersection and took this picture, which I can, even though it doesn't look it, I can guarantee is as carefully structured. I'm looking at every visual relationship. I spent as much time organizing it, but what I wanted to do was organize it in a way that felt modern, that felt like it had the taste of modern experience.
May I come back to the idea of documenting America? Because you said in the interview with David Company that you started photographing America in a way as a stranger. You'd come from the East Coast. This is not the East Coast. No. Maybe Florida, but otherwise that's not the world that you or I growing up in New England, New York recognized. Right. Did it get easier or harder to do the work when you weren't a stranger anymore? Because eventually you actually moved out west.
Yes. It didn't get harder. It did not. I found I immediately loved much of the Southwest in particular, and would go back every year to work there, because in the show at CO Berlin, one of the latest bodies of work was a series of pictures, a large group I did in one day in Winslow, Arizona, which is a city I had visited first in 1972. But the Southwest speaks to me, the architecture and the light and the culture.
Tell us a bit about the light, because you mentioned again in that interview with Company that for many people, a light that would be too intense for you is exactly what appeals. And I think you told the story of, was it Thomas Strutt, who yes. waits even in a very sunny place for that one teeny little
yes,
cloud.
Well, we both Thomas and I were involved in a project photographing in Israel and the West Bank over a period of a number of years. The project lasted about 5 years. And we never were working there at the same time, and we shared an assistant. And on my second trip, the assistant said to me, you know, funny thing, I noticed if you're photographing and there's a cloud over the sun, you'll stand there and wait for the cloud to pass. And with Thomas, he would wait, and now we're talking about a desert country, so I would assume that he's sometimes waiting with great patience for a cloud to come over the sun. So he could, and I said, well, of course, he grew up in Northern Europe, and I learned photography in the Southwest.
So throughout Uncommon Places, you were challenging yourself, you were working to answer this question. Then
and let me interrupt. And also at the same time, it's the two things that you had mentioned with American Surfaces. There is a formal line of attack, but there's also the exploration of American culture at the same time. So, when I'm talking about, in this picture, wanting to find a structure that expresses contemporary experience, that's saying that not just the content of the picture, but the structure of the picture is related to the documentary impulse.
So around 1981, you had answered most of the questions that were popping up. What happened then? Was that a sobering period to suddenly find that, did you almost have a sense that your creativity might be at stake?
At first, I didn't know how to take it. What happened was, as you're saying, for the previous perhaps 8 years, there was this ongoing process of these questions almost arising on their own. I wasn't sitting around thinking, what am I going to do next? They would be these burning questions, and that as I went out, as I described a few minutes ago, as I went out to address them, new questions would arise. I make a decision to do something in a certain way, and that opens another door. And then that process stopped happening. And at first, I didn't know what it meant. And then I recognized that what happened was that through this process, I had gotten command of the formal aspects of photography. And even today, I find this, I have a kind of innate modesty that makes it hard for me to say it. But I realize this is what happened, and that there are various levels of command over a medium. And one is a technical level, and I don't mean simply gadgets and stuff, but understanding that if I change an f-stop, if I change a lens, if I change from black and white to color, if I change a format, I understand what the results are going to be. So that means the technical tools are in my command. And I don't have to think about it. I know what the result will be. That then leads to the structural tools, how to put an image together. What are the formal tools of the medium? And that's what I learned over the decade of the 70s. That I no longer had to think about them in the same way. I didn't have to work them out. That I knew, if I knew what I wanted, I almost automatically knew how to get there. And let me approach it from a slightly different angle. When I took pictures, I only took one picture of anything. And it wasn't a matter of aesthetic discipline, it was a matter of economy. That in those days it cost, I don't remember, maybe $15 to $20 for a sheet of film processing and one contact print. Today it's probably the equivalent of maybe $50. So if I go out and take 10 pictures in a day or 15 pictures in a day, I've spent a lot of money. So I knew that I couldn't limit myself by only taking pictures that I knew were going to be good, because then I'd just take safe pictures and I wouldn't get anywhere. So the limitation I placed on myself is that I would only take one picture of anything. And I don't mean I wouldn't bracket, use different exposures. I meant if I were going to photograph a building, I would walk around it and choose one angle, one distance. I would take one shot. And I didn't mean this as a kind of morally uplifting aesthetic discipline. It was simply I couldn't afford to do anything different. But what I found over time was it forced me to decide what I actually wanted. And I realized that maybe like many people, I think I know what I want, but it really is kind of vague. But when you have to pin it down, what do you want? What is it you want to show? Where is the frame going to go? How close are you going to be? Are you going to stand back and include another house here? Or I found over time that the picture making became faster and faster because I didn't have to struggle with what I wanted, because I began to know what I wanted. So if I know what I want and I come to a point of having control over the formal aspects, then the pictures begin to come very easily. So at that point, thinking about my dinner with Ansel Adams, I realized that it was time for me to change what I was doing. That I would drive into a town and start taking pictures, and there was no friction. They were perfectly composed pictures. They were flawless. They just didn't have that life and energy that comes from the excitement of discovery.
Yeah.
The friction, the heat that comes from friction.
Yeah, the tension.
So at this point, I was living in Montana, and I spent 2 years there before I started photographing the landscape, because I wanted to have perceptions about land that went beyond, oh, isn't this pretty? I wanted to have the same kind of perceptions that I had when I walked into a city. And there was one last formal question that was on my mind, and that was, one of the things that had interested me throughout a lot of the time in the 70s was that every now and then I would see a photograph that had a convincing illusion of three-dimensional space. And I wanted to figure out how to create that. And I did that experimenting with one-point perspective, think about the Beverly and La Brea picture, having vertical lines in tension with the edge to set up the picture plane, having the curb come from the corner of the picture, using telephone lines, using all these structural devices that a city provides to set up the space and create a three-dimensional space, and separating things in space, separating signs going back into the space of the picture. But as I'm walking across this open land in Montana, or cross-country skiing across it, there's this vast space, but it doesn't have any of these structural markers. So the question then for me was, how do I create a sense of deep space in this land when I don't have these visual devices to rely on? And that led me to a whole other area of exploration. Now, take a look at this picture. And I'm going to ask you to do something. Look at the foreground, at the bottom of the frame, and move your attention along the ground without skipping over anything. Just relax it and just move your attention along the ground all the way to the horizon. And let me know, as you're doing this, if any of you have the sensation that your eye is actually changing focus. That as you're looking at something toward the horizon, your eye is literally focusing further away. Does anyone have that sensation? Mm-hmm. So this I find fascinating, because you're looking at a flat screen. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned from that, and this is the center of my experiments and questioning during this period in the 80s, is that there is a mental perception of a picture which can be different from the picture itself. And here's what I mean. When you see anything in the world, when you're looking at me and Melinda and this picture right now, you're seeing a mental image. We have this illusion that we're these little people who live in our heads and that we look out through these windows, but that's really not how things work. Our eyes work almost exactly like a digital camera. Light comes in, is focused by the lens onto a digital array, which is the retina, which acts just like a digital array, converting light to an electrical signal. And in our brain, our minds take that electrical signal and convert it into an image. And that's what we see. That's what you're seeing at this moment. And what I realized was that some photographs send signals to people to when they create that mental image of the picture, it can be three-dimensional. And so I mentioned a control over the technical means of photography, which took my life until the early 70s. And then in the 70s, throughout that decade, getting control of the formal means of photography. And then what I see happening, or what I now see happening in the 80s, was that I spent that decade learning how to control the mental apparatus of photography.
Which makes great sense, almost in a Zen kind of way, because what you describe is mastery. You'd become a master. Mm-hmm. You had the technical side down, and now you move into a kind of, as you say, a mental control. And you described your approach both to the landscape pictures and then later to those New York street scenes as being one where, in a way, you have a mental picture and then you go off and find it. I was struck by an apparent paradox or contrast to the work that you'd done earlier, where you go somewhere and you photograph what
I wasn't getting a mental picture and finding it. I have a mental picture as I'm in front of it.
But you knew you wanted a treeless landscape, for example. You went all the way to Scotland to get it.
Yeah, well, I needed a laboratory for experimentation. And so if you look at Uncommon Places, while there are a lot of other pictures, and there are portraits, there are still lifes, there are a lot of intersections. And the reason there are a lot of intersections is that they were, for me, a laboratory of understanding how to take a very complex three-dimensional space and transform it into 2 dimensions and make sense out of it, so that someone can look at it and almost be able to draw a map of it. When I wanted to experiment with how I can control the illusion of space in open land, I needed open land to do it. So I went to Southwest Texas, where this was taken. I went to Scotland. I went to treeless places so that I could have open land as my laboratory.
You talk about a convincing illusion of three-dimensionality, and as I was looking at some of these, and also the Scotland photographs, it seemed to me almost as if that plane is coming forward, falling out of the picture, ready to fall onto me. Mm-hmm. Is this convincing illusion a suspension of disbelief, or is it a kind of a recognition of artificiality?
I'm not sure it's either. I think it's what I described, that whether we're aware of it or not, we're always building a mental image of a picture, because that's how we see. Mm-hmm. And that some photographers either intuitively or accidentally or consciously have created pictures that speak to that perceptual apparatus.
So, as we said, you move from question to question, you pose different challenges as to yourself, essentially. You're clearly very attached to constraints as a means of moving forward. You said, yes, for example, that you had thought you wouldn't like working with a tripod. You did. Yeah. You went out west and discovered you were facing a beauty challenge. How do I photograph this in a way that isn't shouting out, oh, how pretty? Yeah. There's another constraint that you've brought yourself back to again and again, which is the 24-hour constraint. It's one of the earliest things that we see in the retrospective, that 24-hour series of snapshots along the course of one day. You come back to it much later with your 24-hour on-demand books. Yeah. What's the meaning of the 24-hour constraint? What does it do for you?
I think I probably like a certain kind of pressure when I work. And so, for example, I never crop any of my pictures. And it's not a moral decision. My hero, Walker Evans, cropped his pictures all the time. I want to know when I'm making that decision, when I know I'm only going to take one picture of something, that if I screw up, I've screwed up. And no big deal, I'll take another picture some other time. And I've learned from doing that. But if my goal is to learn about the medium, if that's one of my goals, then the idea that I would save the picture afterward, it becomes irrelevant. That's a different goal. That's the goal of making good photographs. But if the photographs are just a byproduct of the exploration, then it's the exploration that's important. And so it becomes, in a way, irrelevant to crop a picture. If I think, oh, well, this picture would be good if I cut that off there, that's about having an exhibitable picture to hang on a wall. It's not about the experience of solving the problem at the moment. So I think there's part of me that, yes, you're absolutely right, that likes constraints. When I started the print-on-demand books, there were certain formats that were available. Now there are many more. But at the time, there was just one size and a handful of layouts. And I figured out right away how I could get around the layout and do any kind of layout I want. But then I thought, why bother why don't I accept the layout that is given to me and make books work according to that? You know, just as a poet might write in haiku form or sonnet form, I would do the books in iPhoto book form. And the same when I started using Instagram. I knew that there were apps that allowed me to post oblong pictures, but at the time, Instagram was square. And I hadn't taken a square picture in probably 40 years. So I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting.
Okay. I was going to ask about digital because, of course, you have said you were very attached to the discipline and economy that film compelled. Digital, of course, doesn't compel that at all, and yet you're still working, as I understand it, with that kind of an economy when you do digital. So what is the appeal?
Well, it's how I've worked for all this time. I mean, I spent 30 years using an 8x10, taking one picture of anything. Every now and then I would take two. If there were a street corner with people moving, I might take two. But otherwise, there was no reason to. And after doing that for 30 years, well, I don't see why I would do something differently.
No, my question regarded digital itself. What's the appeal of digital under
what's the
those
appeal of digital?
circumstances?
There are a number of appeals of digital. One is, when I made the transition from American Surfaces to Uncommon Places, I wanted a larger picture than I could make with a 35 millimeter negative. The 35 millimeter color negative film at the time, Kodacolor, had wonderful saturation when you made a small print, but completely fell apart by the time you made an 8x10 print of it. So I couldn't make larger prints. And that led me to a larger negative. I got a 4x5 press camera like Ouija, and my intention was to continue American Surfaces with this press camera handheld, but then found I started using it on a tripod. I liked a tripod. I went off on this tangent of 30 years of using an 8x10. But about, 8 years ago or so, 7 years ago, high-end digital cameras started being produced that could produce a result that was technically comparable to a picture made with a 4x5. And so here was a camera the size of a 35 millimeter that could take a picture with the resolution and the continuous tonality and lack of grain of a view camera. And so it was like the tool I had been looking for years. It was marvelous. And one other, at the risk of getting too technical, one of the failures of film is how it responds in low light, that as exposures get longer, the film speed actually begins to slow down. In darker areas in the scene, the film speed is actually slower, and that causes a reduction of contrast and separation of tone. So if I were to photograph you now, where to my eye I can see distinction between the collar of your jacket and your pocket and your sleeve, it would be very hard in a film to record that. But digital doesn't respond to light in the same way. It doesn't have this chemical failure that film has. And so in dark situations, it fills with light in an amazing way. So for a number of reasons, technically, I can produce pictures that I couldn't have gotten otherwise. A lot of the Ukraine pictures, all the interiors, I'm working on a tripod, and I'm bracketing my exposures. I'm taking exposure for the highlights, exposure for the midtones, and exposure for the shadows, and combining them so that the tonal rendition of the print is much more like what it is to our eye and doesn't experience the limitations, the tonal limitations of film.
That's referring to an extraordinary set of photos of Holocaust survivors in Ukraine, also included, of course, in the retrospective.
And let me add one other thing. I mentioned that as I got control of the various levels of the process, I would want to take more pictures in a day. I saw more pictures. And I found I was limited with an 8x10 in terms of how many pictures I could take, just the cumbersomeness of the camera. And I wanted the pleasure of solving more visual problems in a day. And the extreme result of that is my work in Winslow, Arizona, where I don't know, there may be I don't know, a dozen on display here, but there's a book that's published with 65 of them, and that's taken from a slideshow that I've made that was shown at the Barbican of 180. And these are 180 different pictures in a day. And because I work the same way I used to with an 8x10, I take a picture, okay, that's done. I move on to the next picture. Take the next one. That's done, I move on.
I also thought, looking at your Instagram feed, that you've come full circle back to snapshotness, of course,
yes.
with the Instagram. Last question, because I want to work in some audience questions as well, and perhaps you've answered it in your discussion of digital. What can and will you do now that you might not have done as a younger man? And perhaps connected to that, if you are to go out and document America again, and of course you did that in Winslow, what, if anything, has changed?
Well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I mean, right now I'm concentrating on Instagram. And so for the time being, that's the focus of my attention. The summer before last, I took a much briefer cross-country trip than I had taken in the past. I hadn't done a cross-country trip in several decades, and it was a great deal of fun. And what I found was, aside from the city centers of big cities, very, very little has changed. That if you were to look at the pictures, you would not, other than the cars, actually, you would not know that it was 2015 that I did them and not 1975. I mean, they're on commercial strips, there are big box stores that didn't exist then. But other than that, a great deal of it remains exactly the same.
Many, many thanks. Let's turn to the audience now. And Sie können auch Ihre Fragen in Deutsch stellen, wenn Sie möchten. Dann versuche ich eine kurze englische Zusammenfassung. Wir haben, glaube ich, Mikrofone. We do have microphones. Yes, we do. So if you will please raise your hand, then we will come around to you with a microphone.
How does the title Uncommon Places refer to the pictures? Could you explain the word uncommon?
I would say two things. When I was shooting the project before, American Surfaces, that was the title that I had in my mind at the time. I was thinking that I was doing a project called American Surfaces. The name Uncommon Places came in years after most of the pictures were made when I was doing the book. And I think what is behind it is that most of the pictures are of, in fact, very ordinary scenes. But I'm paying very close attention to them. And to say they're uncommon may be a way of saying pay attention to them.
Mm-hmm. Here I have a question as well.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation so far. You mentioned that you had 5 formative events during your photography live events to write. Do you think that another formative event could take place tomorrow or in 3 weeks or maybe a second one?
Absolutely.
Really curious about that.
And I'm not saying I only had 5. I said there were 5 I wanted to talk about that I thought were useful to talk about. But they're formative events that happen all the time.
When you were shooting in the 70s and 80s, you were doing something that was pretty unique. I mean, not too many people were walking around with an 8x10 and shooting. And now your focus is Instagram. And I'm wondering how you find your way with Instagram to be kind of buried among, millions of people of the world who are doing the same thing. And I mean, I'm curious, I use Instagram a lot and I find my way, but it's really hard. And I don't know, my goal is not to stand out, but how do you find the focus?
I agree. My goal isn't to stand out either. I'm just doing my work. I mean, Instagram can be used in lots of different ways, obviously. And some people use it to post endless selfies, and some people use it to promote products they manufacture. I'm interested in artists who are taking pictures for Instagram, not who are posting their best pictures, but who are posting every day and taking pictures every day with Instagram in mind. I'm not saying this is how it's supposed to be used. I'm just saying this is what interests me, and this is what I do. And that doesn't mean it has to be serious. I mean, Instagram is very admitting of very simple pictures, very notational pictures. You see just some quirky little thing that may not be enough to make a picture with an 8x10 of, but works just fine on Instagram. It is accepting of kind of visual jokes. So there are lots of, it has a light touch, and it reminds me in a certain way. Are you familiar with the Polaroid SX70 camera? This was a camera that was popular in the 1970s, and it produced a small square print. that is in fact roughly the size that you would see an Instagram picture on a larger phone. Prints are about that big. And people recognized at the time that there was something special about the SX70, that, you know, I could look at the light from this table coming through this bottle and it looks cool, and I could take an SX70. And people would, the problem with it was they were unique. They were Polaroids. There was no negative. And so some photographers thought, okay, they're square. What if I used a Hasselblad and took the same picture? And it never worked. It always looked heavy. It always looked portentous. It didn't have that light touch that an SX70 had. And everyone who was familiar with the SX70 recognized that it had this particular quality to it. And I see this again in Instagram.
Can I slip one very quick question in there? How is Instagram changing the way that your students work and develop, if at all?
We don't discuss it. I mean, I'm tempted to do an Instagram class, but the part of me that's sort of the disciplinarian knows that they're not going to make any prints. They'll just go out and take pictures with their phones. And at my school, actually, we don't do digital for the first 2 years. Everything is film.
Okay. Wow.
And that...
the craft.
Yes, I think just as I was describing the view camera making decisions physical, going into a dark room and thinking this print is a little too dark, I'm going to make it lighter, and having to go and change the timer and make a new print and evaluate it is a different experience than moving a slider in Photoshop.
Yeah.
It makes it physical, and I think that people, for example, in deciding how dark or light to make a print or what contrast to use, learn to see light in a way that they can't otherwise, and learn to control the process so that when they then go to digital and use Photoshop, it becomes this amazing tool that allows them to do what they want easily, but first they have to know what they want.
Right. Thank you. Here, I have a question.
Stephen, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. So, as you described, you always looked for the perfect picture in your 8x10s. You tried to put in all the information you wanted to have in the picture, or in these landscape pictures. You also thought about the mental influence of the pictures. And in your last 2 books about Israel and the Ukraine, there is a lot of text as well. So my question is, why you now use the text additional to your pictures? Is this a kind of mistrust to the pictures, or is this only the compromise with the editor?
Photography doesn't explain anything. It describes things beautifully. I think it describes better than words can describe. But it can't explain the way words can explain. And the text in those 2 books that you mentioned serve very specific functions. For one thing, in Israel and the West Bank, where I went over a period of 5 years, I very quickly realized that there were cultural signifiers that I wouldn't understand if I hadn't been exposed to that culture. And let me give an example. There's a photograph in Galilee to the Negev of a store window with very futzy ladies' hats, kind of 1940s hats. And what anyone who lived there would understand is that these are the hats that are always worn by certain sects of Orthodox Jewish women. And that without that knowledge, these hats might mean something different. Now, I couldn't go through every picture and explain it. That would be laborious, and it would also rob the pictures of their visual information. I remember going to a show by my friend Joel Sternfeld of his work of photographing utopian communities, and next to each picture was a label that explained what the utopian community was about, because again, the picture doesn't explain that. If you see a group of people standing in front of a house, you don't know that it's a utopian community. And what I saw when people were going through the show was that they were spending 5 minutes reading the label and then passing by the picture. So so there had to be the right balance of text and picture. And so what I wanted to do was to go to maybe 7 or 8 writers and tell each of them, pick one picture and unlock it. I don't want you to talk about me. I don't want you to talk about what a wonderful photograph it is. I want you to talk about the content. Pick whatever one you want, talk about the content. So that the viewer, the reader, would get an indication that each of the pictures could be unlocked. And they may look at it differently. With the Ukraine book, from the pictures, you would not know that these were Holocaust survivors. You have to be told that. Again, pictures don't explain in the way words do. So, but I can indicate that in the title. But what it means to be a Holocaust survivor in Ukraine is different from what it means to be a Holocaust survivor in Poland. Because in Poland, a survivor is someone who's survived a camp. In Ukraine, there were virtually no camps, and a survivor is someone who hid or fled, more likely fled, left all their belongings behind. The stories were remarkably similar. They left all their belongings, they got into a horse-drawn carriage, headed east, got to the Volga, swam across the Volga, or somehow got across, walked into Kazakhstan and worked on collective farms, then came back after the war to claim their homes and found their neighbors had moved in. But I thought the story needed to be told at least once. So there had to be some text that tells the basic story. There didn't have to be text with each of the people. Again, that would change the relationship. Then people would read the text and the pictures would be illustrations.
Yeah.
But there were things that, to understand the pictures, needed to be understood that could only be put into words.
Thank you.
What was the motivation as a very young kid to give photography such a to make photography such a big thing? Just not only take family snapshots, but to make it bigger than a hobby. And the other thing is, what was the day in the factory like when you were 17? So you come to the factory and then what happened? Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd come to the factory around, I mean, my memory is a little vague. Because we're talking about 50 years ago. Do you remember what you were doing 50 years ago?
I think she wasn't here.
So through the mists of time and the mists of drugs, I would get there early afternoon because no one was there before that. Andy would arrive usually, I don't know, usually 2 o'clock or so, unless there was something going on in particular, a visitor coming. He would work for a while. He had a work table where he would work on projects, or he would be setting up, new devices would come, a video camera. When the very first video cameras made arrived at the factory, and he played with it for several weeks. It wasn't the same every day. When the Velvets arrived, things were different. But basically, he would work. There would be people who would wander in during the course of the day, and then they would hang out, and they would just sit. There was a couch, and they would often just sit on the couch for like hours and do nothing.
Waiting for party time, I think you
Yes.
said, right?
And then in the evening, Andy would usually be invited to some event, and whoever invited him understood that whoever was at the factory at the time would go with him to whatever the event was. It could be a movie premiere or the opening of a club or a party at someone's home. And Andy would arrive with this group of people. And then we would eat late at night, early morning. The places that were open that late in New York were usually, there was one uptown restaurant called the Brasserie, but usually because that was more expensive and he would pay for a bunch of people, we went to either Little Italy or Chinatown, and then very early in the morning, like 2 in the morning, people would leave. I was the only person in the group who lived uptown, and Andy lived uptown, and so we would typically share a taxi back, and he'd leave me off, and he'd go on.
And you were allowed to take pictures like all the time?
Yes, all the time. I mean, at first, when I first arrived, I was this kid who was there taking pictures, but within a few weeks, I was just a friend of everyone's, and so I wasn't this strange observer, interloper. I was just part of the people who were there. And let me add that sometimes in these late night cab rides, we would have fascinating conversations. And for me, the most memorable was during the time he was shooting Chelsea Girls. We were riding uptown, and he said he was just coming up with the idea of putting the movie on 2 screens at once. And so he mentioned that to me, and I said, why? And he said, oh, my films are so boring. And I said, well, if you think they're boring, why don't you edit them? And he said, well, I don't know how. And this was so strange because I had read all this film, this highbrow film criticism about the meaning of boredom in his films. and here's Andy saying, oh, my films are so boring.
The young lady had also asked how...
Yeah. It was just an immediate connection I felt with the medium. I mean, I just fell into it, and every medium of expression has limitations. Photography has many. You asked about self-imposed limitations. Well, think about the limitation that you choose still photography rather than film. That's a big limitation. You can't do narrative. It doesn't flow in time. You don't have sound. These are huge limitations. And so I think, at least for me, and I don't want to extrapolate, but I would imagine other photographers too are attracted to it because of the limitations.
I'm struck by your earlier work. I mean, your use of really formal composition makes what could be almost banal images quite beautiful. And I wonder how much beauty constrains your work or your sense of beauty. Is it possible for a good photo to be ugly, for instance? Or are you constrained also by the fact that, at a fairly young age, you were quite famous that, as photography is a sort of conversation with other people, that you're being constrained by other people's conceptions of beauty? Would you feel comfortable taking ugly photographs, or is that impossible?
So let me unpack all that. Yes, the answer, I think an ugly picture can be good. One of the things that having this retrospective show, which originally opened a little over a year ago in Madrid, it was a fascinating experience going into a building and seeing the whole, there are gaps in it because it just would be too big to have everything, but to see a lot of my creative progression all in one set of galleries. And one thing I see is something you're picking up on, which is that from the very first pictures, there is a formal sense of how to organize space in a picture. And I think this is just innate in me. And I'm not saying other people have to do it that way, and I think there can, so that beauty you're seeing, that organization of space, is something that, I see when I was 12 years old. I think the other people's opinion, I don't think influences me. And so I've told two stories today, one the story with Sharkowski and one the reaction to American Surfaces, where people were very discouraging, and that didn't make me change how I took pictures. I would say this, that while you may look at American Surfaces today and think they look beautiful, that may be because your perception has been educated by the work to think that, because what people were saying to me at the time was, they're crap. They look uncomposed. And so let me just go to, so I showed this picture before, and for me this is a more fascinating picture than the other one at the same intersection. But I know full well that for the general public, the other one is the much more popular picture. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that exactly answers your question, but it sort of impressionistically hits at it.
Thanks very much. So I had two more questions, one over here and one over here. I'm only going to take two, I'm sorry, but we're pretty much over our time limit. So that one, and then there was one over here. Yep.
I had a question about emotion. I wondered what kind of role emotion plays in your photographs, whether it's something you feel is in them, or you try to convey them, or is for other people to find in them.
So there are different kinds of emotion that can be accessed in a picture. A few years ago, I had a student who came to me very excited because she took a photograph of a girl crying. And she was so excited, she said, because she took such an emotional picture. And so I wondered, so what is the emotion communicated by the picture? Is it the sadness of the girl that the picture's of, or is it the glee of the photographer that she nailed it? I think emotion can be communicated through the meaning of form and through structure also. And I go back to what I was saying about the Beaumont-Newhall's 4 trends, that there is this emotional level, which he calls the equivalent. The one time I heard Walker Evans speak, which was in 1972, at the time of his large retrospective show at the Modern, he started talking about his pictures being transcendent documents. And I never heard him address this before, or heard about him address this before. And what he was talking about was viewing his pictures, these very austere pictures of the American South, as what Stieglitz would call equivalence, that there is a level in them that's a document, there's a level in them that is an examination of a certain aspect of our culture at a particular time, but that within that there is what he referred to as something transcendent, what I would say is functions like an equivalent. So the subject matter doesn't have to be emotional. It doesn't have to be someone crying. And it doesn't have to be overtly emotional in the picture, but that to my mind, as I was making this picture you're seeing here, I was thinking that it had an emotional context. Now, this is different from, I'm giving you a slightly longer answer than I would have given you a few years ago, because in the meantime, I did this work in Ukraine, where for me, one of the aesthetic problems I was facing was how to deal with something that had the cultural, emotional charge of the word Holocaust without being manipulative, and at the same time without avoiding it. So, I mean, I could have photographed automobiles in Ukraine and taken pictures that completely avoided it. How can I touch on an emotional level that I felt every day when I was there without depending on an emotional manipulation of the viewer?
Thank you. Last one over here.
Hello. If you look to the audience, I mean, if you look to the viewer of the pictures, the reader of your photos, what would you say is your ambition? What is your greatest wish that they bring back from the exhibition, that they feel? What would you say? What is your greatest wish?
I can't say there's one, because the exhibition covers more than 50 years. And so my aims change over time. My aims when I'm photographing really can change from day to day. But one thing that I think is fairly consistent running through it has to do with, and this may get to that very first question about why the title Uncommon Places, is that one of the things I've learned through photography, and I think other people can too, and is central to my teaching of photography, because I teach not in a fine arts school, but in a liberal arts school, which in America means these are people studying not just photography, but they're studying history and chemistry and literature, all kinds of fields, and they can be majors in other subjects. So I can have in a class a history major or a French major, because no matter what you take, you have to take a variety of classes. So I'm not training photographers. I'm doing that also, but that's not the sole aim. So I think about how is photography useful for someone who is going to wind up being a doctor. And what I think is something can be learned by, when people put a camera around their neck, which I guess we don't do anymore because we all have these cameras in our pockets, but I think a lot of people, when you go out with a camera, all of a sudden you start paying attention to the world in a different way. And what I find useful is paying attention to everyday life with conscious attention. And photography may be a way of learning that, and seeing pictures of everyday life that are made with conscious attention, that have that vividness that comes from that comes from conscious focused attention may communicate that to people. And so I think that's one thing I see running through it and what I would hope people get from it.
What wonderful closing words for a very, very interesting, enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Right away. Sharpie will not write.
Thank you very much.